Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Sheila Sweeney, who's a personal friend. She's a member of the AFA Council 8. She's a member of the DSA. She's a local organizer and activist in Valparaiso, Indiana. Good to see you, Sheila.
Thanks for having me on, Vince.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why don't you, since folks don't know who you are, why don't we give a little background, sort of where you grew up, how you got, involved with politics, and how you ended up in Valparaiso?
Sure. I grew up on the southwest side of Chicago, in a blue-collar, working-class neighborhood, not really integrated, mostly white. My parents were immigrants from Ireland. My dad was a union member. He was a crane operator with the 150 operating engineers. I don't know why I'm doing this. Like, I'm operating a crane. My mom was a stay-at-home mom for a while after she got married and had kids. And then she went back to work. And eventually she had a series of jobs. And then eventually she became involved in a union too, for the UFCW, so the grocery store workers. And so that was my background. It was instilled on me, like, college is super important. My parents didn't even finish high school in Ireland, so it was really important that their kids went to school. So I, decided, when I went to school, that I would study something that was going to make me a lot of money. And I grew up like in an era that's quite different now. Like, movies like Wall Street, greed is good, and that spoke to me. And I'm going to be a powerful woman who has money. And especially like when you don't have a lot, you think like that's the answer. So I studied business. My major is finance, believe it or not. And so I started working, for a firm in Chicago after I graduated. And quickly, like within a year, I discovered I hated it. It didn't speak to me. I would get my Wall Street Journal and I would read like the personal stories, and I hated everything else. And so I decided to go back to school and become a teacher. And I taught in Chicago for close to 10 years. My first part of my career, for about 8 years of it, I taught at a charter school, to the chagrin of my union family. But at the time, it didn't occur to me like, oh, that's probably not a great decision. However, I loved my school. I loved the people I worked with, and I learned a lot from them. It's just, I realized as time went on that I wasn't protected by a union. My time wasn't protected. And I think a collective bargaining agreement would have helped us, so we wouldn't have had burnout. I went to CPS, Chicago Public Schools, after that. So my career was working with, for the most part, like 90% of the time when I was in different schools, children who are a high poverty rate, mostly Black children. And the reasons why, I chose the schools I did, were a lot of reasons. I grew up like 4 miles away from really high crime, segregated part of Chicago. Like 4 miles away from me was Inglewood. Right. I was just like really feeling, maybe it was the white savior complex in me, but I was like, I'm going to go there and I'm going to help. But no matter what, I'm really, I look back and I'm happy that I had those experiences. It shaped me. And I loved the children that I worked with. So after teaching, my last year of teaching, it was my breaking point. I was in Chicago Public Schools in Roseland, and my class size was 32 kindergartners, full day, no teacher's assistant. And I had kids with special needs, and they weren't getting what they needed from me, and I was burnt out. And I had a friend who turned me on to her career as a flight attendant, and then I ended up working for the large airline I work for now. So.
What year was that, Sheila? When did you stop teaching?
2007.
2007. What were you thinking during that time? Like, we've got, 9/11 happens, you've got the Bush era with all the wars, the financial collapse, of course, in 2008, and then Obama coming up. What was your politics like at that point,
So I would say, it's a tough question. When the Iraq War happened, I started to feel like I needed to get involved, and so there was a group on the South Side called Southsiders for Peace, and so I looked into them, and then I started going to their meetings. Really, really great folks. A lot of them had been in the fight for a long, long time. Old hippies. And I learned from them, and I enjoyed being around like-minded people. We marched in Chicago against the Iraq War, but I guess at that point in my life, at my age, I felt like I wasn't getting any satisfaction from it. And now looking back, I realized because it was mobilizing. It was a lot of it was a lack of organizing. We weren't building a base. We were just preaching to the choir. So after that, and then as time was going on, when President Obama ran, before he was president, when he ran for office, I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to help this guy out. And so I looked into his campaign, and then they sent me out knocking on doors in Indianapolis, I recall. So he became president, and as time went on, I was really excited about his presidency. And then as time went on, especially because he and Michelle and their family, they lived in the neighborhood that I taught in for 8 years in Kenwood, North Kenwood, Oakland. So I just thought, oh gosh, this is somebody who's from the South Side. Michelle grew up on the South Side. It's going to change the family. It's going to change the lives of the families, the children that I taught. And as time went on, I realized nothing changed.
Yeah.
The neighborhood still had the same problems with poverty and crime. It was really quite disappointing for me. So I became disenchanted, greatly.
Bring us up to, how did you end up? So you become a flight attendant. You're immediately in the union then when you become a flight attendant?
Yeah, you're on probation, and then after that, once you finish probation, you're in the union. So. And
how did you end up then in Valparaiso?
That's because of my personal relationship. I met my partner, Gilles Charriere, who's a pilot.
Oh, love story time. That's okay. We like that on the program.
So Gilles and I started dating, almost 7 years ago now. And so we were back and forth between, I had an apartment on the north side of Chicago, and then I was bouncing around trying to help take care of my mother. And then I had an apartment in the suburbs near her. And so we were just going back and forth, and I would come see him in Valparaiso where he lived. And then he would come and live and stay with me in Chicago. And then eventually I just came here and I moved in with them. So then I became a region person.
What year was this?
So I moved here. I want to say I moved here close to 4 years ago.
Oh, okay. So right around the time of so did you get involved then with the Bernie campaign when you were in Indiana for the last time around? I'm sorry. So in 2016, the 2016 primaries?
So for me, the Bernie campaign was more about donating and just supporting when I could. I still had an Illinois address, so eventually, occasionally, I would drop in on events. And when I was still living in Chicago and in the suburbs, I would go and help collect signatures to put them on the ballot, things like that. I volunteered at probably 2 rallies, but I wasn't as intensely as involved with his campaign as I was around this time. But it definitely it lit a spark in me, and I had never been so excited. Beyond Obama, I mean, donating money was not a thing I did.
Right. Right.
Have a lot of money, so I still don't. But
when did you start the Northwest Indiana Medicare for All group? Because you were sort of one of the driving forces behind that group forming in the region, which I think is really important because groups like that changed the conversation around Medicare for All over the last 3 or 4 years.
Oh, thanks. Well, in 2017, Bernie had lost, sadly, and I was despondent and disappointed. And of course, we've got the current occupant of the White House, Trump, and it was a huge shock and dangerous times. And I thought, okay, I need to start getting involved with things. Prior to that, I had joined a group. Sheila and I had joined a group here locally just, went online. I was like, okay, this group, I didn't know anybody. So this group called Progressives in Action, NWI, really nice people, well-meaning people, good intentions, made a lot of relationships there. And then through that group, I met my co-founder of NWI Medicare for All, Joe Kahn. And so it was, from my personal motivation, was to keep Bernie's name and his ideas around, and as well as like the major tenet of his campaign was Medicare for All. And I wanted us to help educate people in the region about how freeing it could be, whether your insurance is tied to employment or not tied to employment, just kind of shine a light on the injustice of private health insurance and our for-profit health care system. So it was great because our very first event before we even became a group or had meetings was at your space, Park. So
that's right. It was at the space.
Yeah. So that was really great. Yeah, we got to show a documentary, and it was really well attended. And you and Sergio and some of the organizers at Park and now RMC, you guys were instrumental in helping us put that together and even like getting our group off the ground. So. And
what have you learned through doing that? In other words, one of the things I try to do with the, interviewing activists and organizers on the ground is to sort of demystify activism and organizing, because there's been such a gap, I think, between the people who are doing this work and then Americans who are sitting at home knowing something is terribly wrong, but not really knowing what to do about it. And a lot of them just feel intimidated. They're like, oh my God, am I going to do the wrong thing? Am I going to say the wrong thing? What gave you the confidence to sort of just go and do it? And then also what sort of keeps you in the fight organizing?
I don't know. Part of it was probably ignorance. Like, yeah, I'll just do this thing and it will totally work. And so I'd say just what came out of Bernie's campaign from 2016, that energy, and I know it continued throughout the country, that was part of, my motivation. And I thought, okay, if other people can run for office and do other things and organize, I can at least do some small part of building the movement. And just as time went on, like talking to people, hearing their stories, that, kept us going. There are horrific stories, and you would never, you would, but most people wouldn't even believe, that, because you could default on some health insurance bills, and all of a sudden you could have a warrant out for your arrest, and you could be arrested and put in jail because you had outstanding healthcare bills. Like, those are the kinds of things, like, these are stories, real stories of real people, real young mothers in our region who've experienced this, people who are rationing their insulin, so I thought it was important to shine a light on those stories. As time went on, we tried to build an organization that was effective. The jury's still out. The fact that we're proud of the fact that we got our current congressperson to co-sponsor the House bill for Medicare for All. That was kind of a nice win for us. We worked with National Nurses United to have a barnstorm. It's really well attended. We pushed and pressured now almost former Pete Fisklasky to co-sponsor it. We dogged him in his town halls. We made phone calls. So that worked. But now I look back and now I think, like, okay, now he's going to be out of office, and now we have a new representative who's gone backwards. He's not supporting it. He has not pledged to co-sponsor it. And I just think, wow, that's a whole lot of work that had been done, and now it has to start over again. It's really frustrating, and it feels, I don't know if there's a word for it being disempowered, but I feel disempowered by it now. So,
well, I wouldn't get too down. I think it's tough. It's like, I think obviously the history of organizing is like 5 steps back, 1 step forward. There's so many powerful forces out there that beat you back and turn back all of these wins and victories. A lot of the things unions are fighting for, as the stuff the unions are fighting for today are things that unions won 40, 50, 60, 80 years ago. And then they're rolled back, and then you got to fight and claw back to get them. do you plan, I mean, do you think that that's probably the next move with the gentleman, for those who might not know, in Congressional District 1 here in Northwest Indiana, which encompasses a good chunk of the northwestern part of the state, the congressman-elect is Frank Mervan. And so from what we've heard, Frank is a pretty decent guy, but has, I guess, what you would call sort of moderate policies. He's not a reactionary. He's definitely not as bad as Tom McDermott, which I think would have been just an absolute disaster. Is that sort of the thinking? I mean, what are you hearing from folks? I mean, is there need to be a series of actions to pressure him on this issue? I would also probably add the Green New Deal, though I'm not sure where he stands on that. What are you hearing from folks?
Right now, not a whole lot. I feel like organizing has been really challenging with COVID. Like our group, we haven't even met since COVID hit. We've tried to do is we had like one Zoom meeting so far. Unfortunately, two of our major core members are nurses who have been in and out of working in the COVID ward.
Right.
Locally. So it's kind of put the brakes on a lot of our organizing. And going forward, I feel like we're going to have to do some revamping of what our organizing will look like with the group, possibly leadership roles as well. I think, in my opinion, I think we're organizing, and this is just me speaking for myself, not as NWI Medicare for All. I think where it needs to go would be working with nurses and people who work in the healthcare industry here locally. They're not represented by unions. We're in a right to work state, and we have some people who are in unions here, but nurses are not. People who work in home healthcare are not. People who work in nursing homes are not represented. The janitors most likely are not represented. There are people who are on the front lines and they've experienced, this horrific pandemic, and they're not represented by unions. They've had to fight for PPE, and it's like do a bake sale to get a mask that you don't have to reuse. I think that that's where the organizing needs to be in order to help support the people who are on the front lines and also push the agenda of Medicare for All.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, most of the nurses that I know in the region would like to be unionized. I just think a lot, like, they know that the benefits would be there for unionization. I think a lot of them are just, again, confused. How do I get involved with this? What do I do to not get fired while I'm organizing? Are we going to have community support? I mean, I think having a group out there like Medicare for All, NWI, I think is really important, because at least then they can see that there's people in the community who are like, hey, they back these ideas. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think that would be an interesting way to go. You're also a member of Democratic Socialists of America. How did you go from studying finance to becoming a Democratic Socialist?
Yeah, I know.
I mean, you told us some of that, but I mean, I like listening to the journey, because I think one of the things I think we should always do is allow people room to grow. So it's like, if people start out in one place and if years later they're in a different place, I find that to be just as commendable as like someone who starts out as a diehard socialist when they're 19 years old. I mean, I actually like hearing the journey more than I like hearing people who are sort of red diaper babies,
Yeah, I mean, I'm jealous of young people who are so like more radical than I was even like 5 years ago. So I'm jealous of that. I realize that I have so much more to learn, so much more to read. But yeah, going back to the old days, I would say just seeing how, examining as time was going on, how we've been fighting over scraps, and so seeing how the system doesn't work for most people, the majority of people. So I went from having these dreams of, being a millionaire and having people who work under me, and I'm having some sort of management position of power in finance, I have no idea, to seeing like the reality day to day of people who grew up in my neighborhood and working class, blue collar, as well as when I became a teacher, the families and the people in the communities that I taught, it was definitely rigged against them, and it started to really gnaw at me. It took some time, and I'd say until Bernie, I didn't really know the language to put it. I didn't realize, like, oh, what's the enemy? Oh, capitalism. I knew something was wrong, but I just didn't know how to put my finger on it. I didn't know what to call it. I didn't realize, all these predatory systems were really making us fight against each other. I think about, like, all the white flight that was experienced in the southwest side of Chicago. My parents, when they first came to America, they were living, in neighborhoods near Inglewood and different areas, and then all of a sudden they ended up in the neighborhood that I lived in. The over by Fort City Mall. This makes no sense to people. Ashburn, people don't. And it's like, how did we end up there? Oh, white flight. So why did those things happen? It's because everybody was afraid of losing the little bit they had. It was like, oh, declining property values and the blacks or the Hispanics, and it's just like, we're pitting one set of people against another, and they didn't, we're fooled into being class traders. Mm-hmm. So just as time went on, I just started to realize, the system is rigged, and now, as far as being a member of DSA, it just makes more sense to me. I feel like the problems that we face, and a lot of the all marginalized communities face, is that you can directly link it to capitalism. Why in East Chicago are those areas of, like, the Calumet neighborhood, why were they poisoned? We can talk about the toxic industries who extracted from those communities. We could talk about why our public schools have lost all their funding. That's privatization, which you can point it towards capitalism. Why is there a predatory health insurance industry that many of the politicians just are beholden to? Capitalism. So I really think, I even think about, like, what we're dealing with now with excessive force and re-examining our police state. I can put that towards capitalism as well. Even, like, from personal experiences, knowing some of the guys, mostly guys, I could probably think about some girls I went to high school with too, who became cops. And it's like, why do they feel the need to do that? Well, it was a good, steady job, and, good benefits, health insurance, so if they had other choices, maybe they wouldn't have gone into a mainly racist occupation. Not all these people started out the way they are now. They end up, getting into similar to the military, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, I think my family's from the southeast side, which is a little different, but not too much. I mean, the demographic makeup was a little different, probably not as much Irish as on the southwest side originally, but so more Italians, Croatians, Serbians, but still the white flight. Then you have, a collapse of the property values in the area. You have all kinds of things happening, but it was the same thing where, like, a lot of people in that neighborhood who became police officers, they became police officers because they were like, man, it's a city gig. You get good benefits. You get vacation time. And police officers in Chicago, I think traditionally had been treated very nicely. I mean, there's a lot of places in Chicago, small businesses, government places where if you're a police officer, you'll get taken care of. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Bill for you. Come on in and have lunch. We'll pay the bill. Yeah.
Exactly.
Did that ever happen to me when I was a teacher? Never.
No. And I've been very encouraged. I mean, speaking of the protests that are happening now, my family's lived in Northwest Indiana since the mid-90s. And I've never, in the last 15 years of doing activist and organizing work, I have never ever seen the kind of protests that we're seeing now. Not during the anti-war protests during the Bush era, not during the protests against right to work in 2010, 2011, not during Occupy in 2012, not even obviously during Bernie in 2015, 16, or Bernie in 2020. I mean, I've never seen this number of people stretched throughout the region, really throughout the United States. But to see this in places like, I'm sure you saw, I don't know if you're able to attend, but the event in Chesterton, for those who are listening and might not know, Chesterton is a town that's located just north of Valparaiso in Porter County, Indiana, about 40 miles to the east of Chicago and about 15 miles west of where we are in Michigan City. And Chesterton's a town of about 14,000 people, 13,950 of them white. And it was amazing. Like, you had 350 people who came out to the solidarity protest for Black Lives Matter. I mean, I've never seen anything like that before. I mean, so if we can start, I think if we can build a region-wide coalition, cross racial, ethnic, geographical lines of working class, even middle class people who I think identify with these values, who want to change the systems, want to be a part of the movement. I mean, I think, you know, I told a friend the other day, one of the main reasons why I've stayed in Northwest Indiana over time, not just because of wonderful friends and family, for two reasons. One, I see a ton of potential here. And tied to that, I think if you can organize successfully in places like Northwest Indiana, that you can organize successfully anywhere. I mean, I think the amount of, the story of this region is really a story of failed capitalism. I mean, a region that was built on industry, the industry leaves, union jobs are gone. You know, you have cities that are 85% black, 91% white, 10 miles away from each other, extreme segregation, drug problems, over-policing, industrial pollution. Like, we can go down the list. And I've long said that if you can do something significant here politically, I mean, I think that would be such an inspiration for people all over this country. I mean, I really do. I mean, in the same way that Cooperation Jackson is doing what they're doing in Mississippi. You know, I mean, I really believe that. I don't know what your thoughts are. I'm just kind of rambling, but.
Yeah. No, I can say that, you know, coming here, you know, and moving here like 4 years ago, I feel like, similar to you, that there is so much potential for movement building and putting campaigns together, more so than in big cities like Chicago, and I feel like there's something bubbling. You know, it's ready. There's potential. It's ready. It's bubbling. It's ripe. It's ready. More than some of the sleepy suburbs around, you know, like the Chicagoland area where I last lived before I moved here. You know, people are just, you know, half asleep. But I think with just some good organizing and popular education, a lot could happen, and I find it encouraging. After Bernie's campaign, now this last campaign, I'm hoping that there'll be groups that pop up. You know, we're really inspired by what you guys have been doing in Michigan City. You know, your group RMC. Myself and some folks here locally in Valparaiso, we put an event together right before COVID hit and right before Bernie dropped out, called Bernie Palooza. And so some of the folks that helped organize that with me, now we're trying to start a group here in Valparaiso. And I hope, like you were mentioning Chesterton, I hope that comes out of, or happens for other towns too, like Chesterton, like Portage, like Porter, in LaPorte County and other towns in Lake County. I mean, I think it's there, and it's just a matter of people. I think what happens is, if you don't have winnable gains, then people kind of tend to walk away. I'm excited, like you're mentioning, about like all the actions, all the protests, even in our town of Valparaiso, our very, very white town that's, you know, they're really trying hard to gentrify here. There have been many vigils, and well, there was one vigil, but protests happening, and they're being organized by youngsters. I sound so old. I'm almost 50, so excuse me. But they're being organized by, you know, 19, 20-year-olds, and I love it. I just hope that we can, and other people can, help take that energy and shift it towards strategic action.
And I totally agree with you. And can you give folks an idea? I think there's a sense, and I've probably been guilty of this in the past, but I think there is a sense that then this will be a really specifically like sort of region question, but it's like there are a lot of poor and working class people in places like Valparaiso that you still have. I mean, the fight for affordable housing is happening there. As you're mentioning, they are trying to gentrify the city and not trying to get rid of people of color because there's not necessarily a large percentage of people of color to get rid of in the city. But like, there is a number of poor and working class people who live there. And I was just talking with a friend the other day, watching the transformation of Valparaiso over the years has been, I mean, really horrific. I mean, we used to, even though there was a rival, I went to Chesterton High School, so there was a rival between the two cities or the two towns, but we used to go to Valparaiso all the time. Like, we would go hang out there. Like, we'd go hang out in the Fazoli's parking lot with like people with their hot rods and like, you know, race cars and stuff, just like causing trouble, smoking pot, stupid stuff like that. But I always had the sense that like, oh yeah, Chesterton and Valpo are very like white towns, but like, there's a lot of working class people who live in these towns, you know. Over the years, like this explosion of like huge subdivisions in Porter County, and then like this, you know, again, more white flight from the city and people leaving Chicago to come live in Northwest Indiana, the explosion of like, you know, boutique storefronts and like high upscale sort of restaurants. And it's like the last time I was in downtown Valparaiso, I drove by a place where they were like valet parking someone's car. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, what the hell is going on here? But yeah, if you could just speak to that.
Like that. Yeah, you've got places like that, you know, some of these, you know, these businesses, and everybody, you know, in power is excited about, you know, like things, you know, this type of stuff. But the people who actually work there can't afford to live here, you know. Right. So we've got servers, you know, serving, you know, all the folks who wish this was Naperville, you know, like whatever they want Valpo to be. And, you know, the people cooking your food, the people waiting on you, the people who are cleaning the bathrooms, everybody, the people who are working at the nursing homes, nobody can afford to live here, you know. And the way it's framed by the people in power here is, you know, you don't want to Chicago up the place, you know. So, you know, it's just a dog whistle for, we don't want any more like folks of color. The few people we have, we don't, you know, we don't want poor people. We don't need to have affordable housing here. There's plenty, you know. So, yeah, they're confusing a lot of people, and they're instilling fear. And it seems very similar to me. It's eerily similar to what went on probably around my parents' era. It's, you know, like, it's just instilling fear into working class and middle class people, as far as like, oh, this is going to take away from you. You know, it's like, oh, we can't have more affordable housing because that's going to take away your property values. That's going to take away, versus like, no, don't you want a thriving community that's good for everyone who lives here? Don't you want the teachers who are starting out in our schools to be able to actually live in our communities and not struggle and not have to have like 5 roommates? You know, it's you know, it's strange framing, and it's gotten a lot of people turned around in the wrong ways. And I think about like last year we had a mayoral race, and it was the first time we were going to have a new mayor in I can't even remember how many years, and city council. And my partner Jill, he ran for city council, and good friends ran, and you know, another person that I like ran for mayor, but it was a failure. And not that it wasn't, you know, they did good work, you know, knocking on doors, talking to people. I don't mean to like to shit on anyone, but it failed, you know. And I look back and like, why did that fail? It's because there was no base building that had gone on before this. And when I say before this, maybe in the last few years, maybe in the last 10 years, you know, the people in power in this town, they all go to the same churches. They, you know, they're friends with each other, and the developers are friendly with them. But we don't have, and this is, I'm stealing words from a friend, Martin Schaefer Murray. We don't have church. The left in this town, we don't have the church. We don't have the the Chamber of Commerce camaraderie going on for us. And so that's what needed to happen before we thought like, oh yeah, we're going to put people up for office. It's like, well, if you haven't been reaching out to all the folks who stay home and don't bother to vote because they don't even understand what the offices are for, yeah, or how that would even change their lives materially, then why would they come out and vote? This town doesn't have to be red. This town doesn't have to have, the Chamber of Commerce sponsoring everything. This town could be way more people-centered versus, business centered, but the organizing hasn't taken place. And I'm not trying to shit on anyone who's done a lot of work here for many, many years. I just got here, so I don't want to sound like some know-it-all, but that's just my view from being here, that, the work hasn't been strategic enough. There's been a lot of preaching to the choir, but not reaching out to the others. So.
And it takes a long time. People have asked us in Michigan City why we haven't ran people for office. Now, in hindsight, we might have been too reluctant to not run people. In hindsight, we probably could have ran a couple people and likely been somewhat successful. But even, we've been dug in here for 3.5 years with our MC and Park. And even now, we look around and we're like, all right, do we have, not for one of us to run, but even to identify people in the community who are those sort of organic leaders, to steal a term from Jane McAlevey. I think it's a really tough balance. I think it's all the right questions, though. I know I mentioned her name, but I know that her work has also influenced you as well. How would I put this? Has it been difficult to have these conversations with other activists and people you know? In other words, you're coming to a lot of conclusions very quickly where you're like, okay, this effort failed, and that doesn't make me want to give up. It makes me want to dig in even more. It makes me want to, rethink this, do it more strategically. Is that the sense you're getting from other people who are sort of self-identified activists, or what's the kind of sense you're getting from people in Valpo? Because to your point, it's the same argument that we make for Chesterton. People think Chesterton is just this like podunk town of racist white people. 350 people in a town of 11,000 or 14,000, whatever it is now, show up to this protest. And it's much like the situation in the country. Like Valpo and Chesterton remind me of, like, in some ways, not demographically, but politically, like a microcosm of what's happening in the country, where a very small percentage of people can actually hold power, and they don't represent the majority. The majority of people in Chesterton and Valpo, if you were to go house by house, probably agree with much of these progressive values. They're just disorganized. They're not in contact with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
What are the people, the question, no, it's all good.
What are people's thoughts?
Yeah, what are you hearing from people now? Where do you guys want to go from here? Is there also a sense among the other, liberal all the way to progressive left folks in Valparaiso that, like, hey, we've done some decent work, but we kind of have to recalibrate, do things a little differently? Let's sort of end there. Like, what are you hearing from folks, and what do you folks plan on going from here?
So I can't speak to like what are people saying now as much. I really feel disconnected because of COVID.
Got you.
I've had conversations with people, virtually like this, and then with the core organizers of our ValpoACT group. We've been trying to meet in person, but 6 feet apart, in garages in the backyard. But the folks that I used to come in contact with more often, the wider scope of lefties, liberals, progressives, Dems. I don't see them as often. I'm not communicating with them as often. I guess if I just kind of glanced at social media, my worry would be that they're just relying on get out the vote. And that scares me a little bit, because that's not enough. And I don't know if it came from you guys or someone else, but that whole idea of like, that's just one spoke of a wheel. If you think about like all the spokes, like that's just one part of it. I'm not saying like, oh yeah, don't vote, it's meaningless. I'm not trying to preach that. I always vote, but to think like, okay, getting people registered to vote and voting and blue no matter who, or whatever the phrases are, like, to me, that's lazy and scary. And it's putting all your eggs in a basket that has a hole in the bottom, So I hope that people will, be doing deeper digging, and seeing that, that there's more work to be done than the way we've been doing it, because if you keep doing the same thing the same way over and over again, what is that, ignorance or being an ass?
No, absolutely.
But I hate to sound super critical either, because then I'm breaking the rule of meeting people where they're at, and I want to be mindful of that. I don't want to piss people off who have good intentions and who have a lot to offer. I want to bridge those, I want to build bridges and bring people over so that, no one's wasting their time. I mean, we're not getting paid. There is no George Soros money here. At least I'm not getting it. So this is all volunteer work, and, we're all trying our best, but I would love to see really great, really smart people with a lot to offer being more strategic. So.
Yeah. No, I think that's great advice. How about another piece of advice, and we'll leave it here, but there's a lot of people who are just getting involved with this work for the first time, as usually this happens during movement moments. Whenever you have an upsurge of mobilization efforts, there's new people who come into the mix, and they come in very quickly, and they come in quite radical. In other words, I'm probably less radical than I was when I first came in, where I was like, we need to burn this whole thing down, Che Guevara, overthrow the system. We need armed revolution. That's where I was at 22 years old, getting involved with left activism. But I've had to temper some of that, and you get a little more sophisticated, your analysis, and you become more mature as a person. But there's a lot of people who are coming into this for the first time, and no, it's not like you have all the answers or all the advice in the world, but it's like you come from a very ordinary background. It's not like you were groomed to be a socialist. So, what would your advice be for people who are just getting involved with this?
For me, I guess I would say read as much as possible. Dig into some documentaries. Try to talk to your friends and neighbors, in more intentional ways, about well, if they're complaining about how they're getting screwed, talk about that and try and dig deeper and get to the root of your boss is cutting your hours. Yeah, let's talk about that. Why do you think that's happening, and what would be better for you? And what do you think are some of the ways that we can solve these problems? I go back and forth because, I think about organizing and how you need to have skin in the game. And so for me, being in my union, I can only do so much because my next door neighbor isn't a flight attendant, right? And, I don't have a lot of people in my community who have the same workplace as I do, so I can't do workplace organizing. But I do feel like there's potential for the folks who do work together. So, if I'm talking to some younger person who happens to work at, I don't know, let's say Target, I really hope that they talk to their coworkers and talk about the issues that they're having, with their boss, with management, with the corporation itself, talk about what they're struggling with, and find that they have, power in collective action as workers. So, and I really think when we talk about what pits us against each other, and if you want to talk about xenophobia, racism, and all of the isms, if you can start in a place of solidarity and what you have in common. And for me, it's okay, well, your workplace is a really great place to start, as well as, your immediate community. So. Right
on. Well, thank you for that. It was a pleasure having you on. See, it wasn't as bad as you thought it was going to be.
I'm going to go throw up now. Thanks.
No, get out of here. I thought it was great. Thank you so much. And tell Gilles we said hello, please.
I will. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Sheila.
I appreciate you guys so much.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate you. That's why we're talking to you. Tell Gilles we said hello, please. And we wish you guys the best. And even if we have to come hang out in your backyard, I'd like to see you guys at some point.
Will do.
Or we'll see each other in the streets.
Yeah,
all right.
Sure.
Take care,
Enjoy
sister.
The rest of your day. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. You've been watching Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we'll talk to you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parcmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Parc Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.